Puddle Lane, the tidy bird. The tidy bird. One day, Sarah and Gita were playing in Puddle Lane when Mr. Gotobed opened the front door of his house and looked out. "Have you seen my spectacles anywhere?" he asked them. "No," said Sarah. "Aren't they in your house?" "I don't think so," said Mr. Gotobed, "but it's very difficult to see them when I haven't got them on." "Can we come in and help you to look for them?" asked Gita. Mr. Gotobed looked out of his house. "Would you look in the garden for me?" said Mr. Gotobed. "I was in there yesterday. I had a little nap under a tree, and when I woke up it was dark, so I came straight home." "We'll go and look now," said Sarah. Then Mrs. Pitter-Patter came up the lane. Mrs. Pitter-Patter came up the lane. "Good morning, Mr. Gotobed," said Mrs. Pitter-Patter. "Have you seen my red feather anywhere?" "Red feather?" asked Mr. Gotobed. He sounded very puzzled. "Yes, the red feather I wear in my hat," said Mrs. Pitter-Patter. She turned to Sarah and Gita. "You haven't been playing with it, have you?" Mrs. Pitter-Patter said, "Have you seen my red feather?" Sarah and Gita had only time to shake their heads when Mr. Puffle came up the lane with Davy. "Morning, Mrs. Pitter-Patter. Morning, Mr. Gotobed," Mr. Puffle said cheerfully. "You haven't seen my paintbrush, have you? I was painting my window box and I put it down somewhere in the lane." "I've been looking in the lane," said Davy, "but it's not there." Davy and Mr. Puffle came up the lane. "I haven't seen it," said Mrs. Pitter-Patter, "and I've lost my red feather. Someone must have taken it." She looked very hard at Sarah and Gita. "We haven't touched it," said Sarah. "We were just going in the garden to look for Mr. Gotobed's spectacles. We'll look for your red feather too, Mrs. Pitter-Patter. Do not disturb." Mrs. Pitter-Patter looked at Sarah and Gita. "You go with them, Davy, and keep an eye out for my paintbrush," said Mr. Puffle. Sarah, Gita, and Davy went through the gate into the garden. Sarah, Gita, and Davy went into the garden. The children were looking under the bushes in the garden when they heard a little sound behind them. They turned round and saw the Griffle. "Are you looking for something?" the Griffle asked in his whiffly-griffly voice. "We're looking for Mr. Gotobed's spectacles," said Sarah. "And Mr. Puffle's paintbrush," said Davy. "And Mrs. Pitter-Patter's red feather," said Gita. "They're all lost." They saw the Griffle. "I think the tidy bird must be about," said the Griffle. "What do you mean, the tidy bird?" asked Sarah. "He tidies everything away in his nest," said the Griffle. "What does he look like?" asked Gita. "I don't know," said the Griffle. "He's invisible. You can't see him." The Griffle said, "The tidy bird must be in the garden. You can't see the tidy bird." "How can we watch where he goes?" demanded Sarah. "He has a little red light on the top of his head," said the Griffle, "and you can hear him. He whistles as he flies." "Let's hide and wait for him," said Sarah. So they hid behind the hollow tree and waited. Davy and Sarah, the Griffle and Gita all hid. They hadn't been waiting long when they heard a soft whistling sound. "Listen," whispered the Griffle. "Here he comes." They saw a little red light moving through the air. The tidy bird flew into the garden. As they watched, the tidy bird dropped down behind a bush. When he flew up again, he was carrying a ball. They couldn't see the tidy bird, but they could see the ball as it flew through the air. "That's my ball," whispered Sarah. "I lost it in the garden." Sarah saw her ball. The little red light and the golden ball flew towards a tree. The children and the Griffle followed. "There's a big nest in the tree," whispered Davy. The tidy bird must have heard him, for the whistling suddenly stopped. The red light vanished. "He's gone," said the Griffle. The tidy bird flew to a tree. Sarah, Geeta, and Davy all ran to the tree and looked into the nest. "Here's my ball," cried Sarah, picking it up. "And here are Mr. Go-to-Bed's spectacles." "Look, Mrs. Pitter-Patter's red feather," said Geeta. She took it out of the nest. Davy, Sarah, and Geeta looked in the nest. "And here's Mr. Puffle's paintbrush," cried Davy. "We must take it to him. He's going to paint his back door." "We'll come back and play, Griffle," said Sarah. "Please don't go away. But we must take these things back to Puddle Lane first." "We must go back to Puddle Lane," said Sarah. "We found them," cried Sarah. "We found them," cried Geeta, as Davy pulled open the gate, and they ran into Puddle Lane. Mr. Puffle and Mrs. Pitter-Patter were still there talking to Mr. Go-to-Bed. "Here's the paintbrush," said Davy. "However did my paintbrush get into that garden?" exclaimed Mr. Puffle. "I can guess," said Mrs. Pitter-Patter. They ran back into Puddle Lane. "The tidy bird took it," said Sarah. "He takes all kinds of things and tidies them away." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Pitter-Patter, snatching the red feather and putting it in her hat. "Don't take my feather again. Play with your toys and leave my feather alone." "We didn't take the feather," said Sarah. "We found it in the tidy bird's nest." Mrs. Pitter-Patter put the red feather in her hat. Mrs. Pitter-Patter only tossed her head and went off down the lane. "Thank you, Sarah," said Mr. Go-to-Bed. "I'm glad to have my spectacles." "And I'm glad to have my paintbrush back," said Mr. Puffle as Davy handed it to him. "I've a lot to do today." Mrs. Pitter-Patter went off down the lane. "Listen," said Geeta, "the tidy bird." As they all stood listening, the tidy bird came flying out of the garden. They saw his little red light flying down the lane. He was flying after Mrs. Pitter-Patter. The tidy bird flew down the lane. As they stood there watching, the tidy bird pulled the red feather out of Mrs. Pitter-Patter's hat and flew away with it, up the lane and into the garden. Mrs. Pitter-Patter didn't know that anything had happened. She went into her house and banged the door. The tidy bird flew away with the red feather. "So that was the tidy bird," said Mr. Puffle. "You'll have to look for that feather all over again." He went off down the lane laughing. "Dear me," said Mr. Go-to-Bed. "I must make sure he doesn't take my spectacles." He went back into his house. "Let's go back to the Griffle," said Davy, and the children went back into the garden. Peter, Davy, and Sarah went back to the Griffle.